morning. Thanks for joining us for this breakfast conversation. We're talking about the Victorian state election. The date is the 26th of November this year, and I think that we already have a strong sense of election thoughts being in the air. Certainly this morning we recognise that we come in the middle of a significant flood event for many people, perhaps some who are online or intending to be online, and we are very conscious of the many things that are happening throughout the state of Victoria and more widely to try and mitigate against the further effects of those rising floodwaters. I join you from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'm sure that as we join from different lands, we might be conscious of the traditional owners of those lands and respect their custodianship, and thank God for their continuing engagement in care for country and the responsibilities they bear in that way. We have three people that we're engaged in conversation with this morning. Danielle Wood, who is from the Grattan Institute, where she's the CEO and leads a team of leading policy thinkers, researching and advocating policy to improve the lives of Australians. And Danielle also leads Grattan's Budgets and Government program and has published extensively on economic reform priorities, budgets, tax reform, women's workforce participation, generational inequality, and reforming political institutions. And she's a sought after media commentator and speaker on policy issues. So Danielle, glad we've got you here today. And previously, Danielle was a principal economist and director of merger investigations at the ACCC, a senior economist at the NERA Economic Consulting and senior research economist at the Productivity Commission. And she holds an honours degree in economics from the University of Adelaide and two master's degrees, one in economics and one in competition law from the University of Melbourne. Danielle's a member of the Australian Government Women's Economic Equality Task Force, the Parliamentary Budget Office Expert Advisory Committee, and the Commonwealth Bank CEO Advisory Council. And she's an honorary fellow and former president of the Economic Society of Australia and a research fellow of the Women's Leadership Institute. And she's also a passionate advocate for women in economics and was the co-founder and first chair of the Women in Economics Network. So welcome, Danielle. And welcome too to Travers McLeod. Travers is the newish executive director of the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. He joined BSL in April this year. So I guess we'll stop saying new by the time you've done your first year, Trav. And he joined from the Centre of Policy Development, an independent policy institute in Australia, where he led it as the CEO for 8 years and remains connected with it as a senior fellow. Travers began his career in public law, working for the State Solicitor's Office in Western Australia and for Justice Michael Kirby in the High Court of Australia. Travers holds a DPhil and an MPhil with distinction in international relations from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar and was a lecturer in politics and international relations. Travers worked as a policy advisor for the Oxford Martin School of the University of Oxford, playing a leading role in their 2013 report Now for the Long Term. He's the author of Rule of Law in War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and he remains an associate fellow of the Oxford Martin School and holds adjunct positions at the University of Melbourne and the University of Western Australia. He's a board member of the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture and an occasional moderator for the Cranlana Centre for Ethical Leadership. Travers grew up in Exmouth and Perth in Western Australia. He's now married to a Kiwi. They and their two young daughters now call Melbourne home. So welcome, Travers. And Sean, lovely if you could join us, a regular columnist for The Age newspaper, where he formerly served as an associate editor and state political editor. A noted music writer. Sean is a Vice Chancellor's Professorial Fellow at Monash University and the author of Peter Costello, The New Liberal. He's also written books on leadership, politics, industrial relations, and Press Escape, a memoir of family and journalism. He's married to Caroline, author and journalist, and father of two girls. So welcome today, Sean. If we're in the one place, we'd have a rousing round of applause at this point for you all, but we have to just endure the silence of our online experience. We haven't yet got our technology to emulate that. Well, with the election coming up, I thought I just might go and sort of do the rounds of our table about the presenting issues that you're seeing and hearing. Sean, tell us, what do you think presents itself to you as some of the key moments for us?
Um, First of all, it's great to be here with you and to be able to discuss this in such a way. I think ultimately this election, as far as I can see, will actually be about leadership more than anything else. I think the policies, of course, are important, but they're, I think, a very, very important backdrop. But ultimately, there's something that's been going on clearly this year as the Victorian community and the Australian community in general has tried to reckon with the trauma of the pandemic and all of its consequences, economic and social, personal, familial, psychological. And there's this push and pull about whether we want to have a reckoning about what went on and whether we want to just get away from it, just try to get back to normalcy. So I think we're looking for leadership. We opted for change only just, I think, at the federal election. And I think it will come down to, ultimately it is, I think, I wish it was something else, but it will be in many ways a referendum on leadership and who can be trusted to lead the state out of this roiling period that we're still going through. I think ultimately that would be my sort of top of the line take.
Thanks, Sean. And Danielle, as we continue to paint the picture of what it looks like, what's your take?
I think I agree with Sean's top level take. I mean, I think that elections are always about leadership and leader popularity to some degree, but it does seem particularly pronounced this time around. So obviously there is the sort of the strong feelings that are still bubbling away coming out of COVID, as Sean says. I mean, I think Labor and Dan Andrews have last time around and this time run that sort of very presidential style campaign, and Dan obviously sort of tries to project this sort of sense of competence and delivery. So it sort of looks like 2018 in the sense that sort of a focus on, you know, I'm making these big promises, particularly on the infrastructure sense, and I'm going to go on and deliver those. Whether that will have the same resonance this time round, particularly given some of the challenges that they've had in delivering the previous big projects, and the opposition is now actually taking quite a distinct stance, particularly on suburban rail, which is kind of the big signature promise. So that does actually open up a front of policy difference, which I'm always keen to talk about. But that broad sense of who can you trust, I think Sean is absolutely right. And that's I think, a really interesting lens to be thinking about this contest. You know, I think neither side has totally clean hands when it comes to trust and integrity. So the fact that that is actually the front that this is being fought on is very interesting indeed. And I would actually like to see, if we're going to go down that direction, more focus on how do we actually deliver government that is cleaner going forward, that deals with some of these integrity problems. I'd like to see the kind of policy dimension of that integrity debate bubble forward, but at the moment it's sort of just focusing on the surface.
Thanks, Danielle. And just pick up, Trav, your perspective on what's the macro shape of things as we're coming into this election period.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Archbishop. And can I just quickly start by from saying hello to Danielle and Sean and yourself, just acknowledging, as you did, the traditional owners of the lands I'm joining from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. There was a very special elder from this area, particularly from BSL's headquarters in Fitzroy, who was honoured yesterday with the state funeral, and just want to pay tribute to elders past and present, particularly him. But I think my observation of where we're heading is, with the state election, is that it's been a very tough period for everyone, right? All Victorians, and especially our leaders. You know, they've been stretched, and there seems to be a collective exhaustion in Victoria, and the events of the last week will only exacerbate that. If we think over the last 3 years, there's been bushfires, a pandemic, floods now and a huge cost of living crunch. And my sense is that the election will ultimately be about not just leadership, but the sort of society we want as we recover from those systemic shocks, and what it means to invest properly in the social and economic infrastructure that will help us to do that, and how we can empower citizens to lead their best lives. And so I agree with Sean and Danielle that part of the election will be who is best placed and trusted, who's regarded as the most competent to lead us towards that brighter future. And there are some storm clouds on the horizon, fiscally and otherwise, that will constrain the choices of the government, whomever is elected.
Yeah, I'd like to open up this question of trust, because at a high level, it just sounds could sound a bit like a personality competition of the impression the person makes on us individually and corporately. But I suppose, to me, the trustworthiness would also go a bit deeper, to go into the extent to which we look at relationships to the public service, the capacity of various ideas being tested, the capacity of ideas which often need implementation longer than an electoral cycle to be built up. What's the kind of the bilateral and cross-party support that can be achieved for some of the bigger structural changes we might need. So do you just want to open up any of you who might have an insight as to how we if it is going to be about trust and confidence, how we inform ourselves of some of the deeper things that might truly be better placed to give us that confidence and trust? Go on, Danielle.
I'll have a go. Look, that's a very challenging question. So, I mean, ultimately, when I think about trust and what that means, I sort of think about it on two dimensions. So one is delivery. Do I sort of set a vision and then do what I say I'm going to do? And the other is more around integrity. So do I act in a way that is consistent with what the people of Victoria would expect, always thinking about the broader public interest rather than personal or political interest. So I think both of those fronts are relevant here, and those are things we should be thinking about. It's much easier, of course, to judge the government because we have a record on those things. It's when we're talking about oppositions, we're trying to infer how they might behave. So I have some broad concerns around both delivery and how decisions have sometimes been made, and particularly in that sort of infrastructure space. We're seeing it again now with promises around kind of new hospitals, that often things seem to be done with an eye on both sides here, with an eye to kind of politics rather than where is the greatest need, and that concerns me. And as I said before, I think integrity policies is an area where we're actually lagging as a state. Grattan's just put out a whole series of reports looking at issues like politicisation of public leadership roles, things like public sector boards, pork barrelling of grants, misuse of government or taxpayer funded advertising to promote political messages. And, they are, when we look around the country, there are governments across the board can do better, but we have had particular problems in Victoria. And I don't see either side at the moment talking about the kind of policies you would need to try and clean that up going forward. So those are the sort of things that I'm looking for in terms of, what's actually the detail of what you're proposing, and how do you say you're going to do things differently going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Travers.
So I think Danielle's given sort of a beautiful taxonomy of trust and credibility around sort of a vision, the ability to steer towards it, and the integrity and reliability of delivery. And we've seen, both in terms of state governments and national and local governments, fault lines in the delivery of services on which individuals and communities rely. I would add one thing to what Danielle put, and that's honesty and the willingness to level with the community about the choices that will confront sort of a return government or a new government. We've seen, the quite frightening scenes in recent days around flooding, and, climate extreme weather events is one of those things on which I think we're better to level with communities about what is ahead and what needs to be done by way of mitigation and adaptation. But elections are as much about the choices that we do talk about as they are about the choices that we don't talk about when it comes to the social infrastructure on which communities rely. And I think a big part of trust is the willingness of leaders to level with their communities about what is possible and what might not be possible.
And Sean, you've been an observer of this through your role as journalist for a sustained period of time. I'm just wondering what the change to the whole character of journalism, what the impact is on this, how concepts of trust are constituted now with the rise of social media, and I think, in a sense, a disinvestment in a lot of the traditional forms of journalism. What are you seeing as the way in which politicians seek to constitute this sense of trust and confidence now, and how that might have changed?
Well, I think in the Victorian context, it pains me in many ways to say so, given how my life has been spent in the journalistic world, that conventional sort of legacy journalism has less and less influence up to this point in directing a lot of the political dialogue, but also the community's political sympathies, if you like. I mean, it was actually a news item just in the past few days that the Premier hasn't been on Virginia Trioli's program for a year. He hasn't been on Neil Mitchell's talkback show for 5 years. He is, I think it's fair to say, and I actually wrote for the Herald Sun for 7 years up until 2020 as a regular columnist. So I had a little bit of exposure to this, but they're not exactly big fans of Daniel Andrews, and going all the way back to when he took over as leader in 2010. And they campaigned pretty strongly against him. I think that's a fair thing to say. The Age is becoming increasingly sceptical of him. But against all of that, he's still tipped by most people, and so many of us could be wrong. I'm not even sure I know what's going to. I can make a prediction about the election, but he still appears to have primacy in the contest. So he followed a very strong social media, or built up a very strong social media presence, and did a lot of his campaigning that way. So now we're in just a very, very diffuse environment in terms of messaging. It's very hard to track it ultimately. So this actually makes it much harder, I think, to have meaningful conversations in the public sphere about policy, actually. And I think what we saw in 2018 was that the government won in a landslide by talking about delivery. I mean, Travis and Danielle make great points about trust and delivery. Andrew's basically built on his social media identity, I think, and the infrastructure delivery. But of course, that's if they were to rely on that this time around, they're just really relitigating the last election, which is not, even incumbents don't really want to do that. So
Sean, what's your advice to people who have joined us online today? They're interested to get behind some of the superficial things and actually have a serious understanding of the choices that are before them. How in the modern era does an ordinary citizen best inform themselves of what's really happening, rather than just being, lured into the making choices about impressions?
Look, you might be asking the wrong person.
I'll ask Travis and Danielle as well.
I think you still actually have to pay attention to as much, conventional media as you can, to get a sense of things and to try to keep up. But it takes a bit of work. This is one of the problems. People generally aren't consuming news in the way that they did, and there are all sorts of reasons. That's probably subject of another breakfast, I suppose. But and I'm not sort of trying to wangle another invite, but I'm just saying that. But I think That's still the best way, in my view. That's still the best way. Also, if you believe in something, join a political party, for heaven's sake. So few people are members of political parties anymore. They're not informing. So it's very much top down. Politics now is so much top down. It's not coming up from the community, certainly in the larger parties anyway.
And any insights, Danielle? Or yeah, Danielle, what's your insight? How we go a bit deeper? How can we go deeper on the real matters that really count?
Look, so I agree with Sean. I think you do need to stay tapped into mainstream media, and I'll do a little plug for The Age, Sean, if you won't. But I mean, they're doing something quite interesting this election, which I like, which is they've sort of focused on 6 key issues. They chose those issues or questions, so they span health, education, transport, the economy. They sort of chose those issues after running roundtables with experts and people with lived experience. They're going out, engaging with the public on those questions and seeing what they're thinking. And then they're also doing explainers and bringing facts to the table in a really neutral way on each of those topics. So I find that a really positive development in election coverage. And I've actually used that on a number of occasions just to kind of see what's going on in health debates or education debates. There are, I think there's some positive developments in the media landscape. The Conversation, which features articles written by academics, freely available. They don't do a lot on state politics, but there will be bits in the lead up to the campaign. And then I think conversations like this, where you're getting people bringing, different perspectives to the table. Go on social media if you can handle it. I sort of, it's not my preferred place to get news, but I do follow key people to see what's going on as well. And I think depending on how much time you want to devote, if you can kind of bring together those sort of different sources of material, you can end up with a fairly comprehensive picture of what's going on.
Yeah, Travis, what do you think?
Oh, I thought Danielle was going to give a plug to independent policy institutes, and I'll do it for her as well. So, I mean, obviously, places like Grattan and others are good independent sources of kind of what's going on. And I agree, it's terrific that some of the media outlets are talking to communities and participants within services and understanding their experience of the state of the polity at the moment and what's working and what's not working. But the only thing I'd add, I agree, we've got 90 sites around Victoria, BSL, and we hear from people across the life course every day about how they're faring, and people are doing it very tough, not just because of the systemic shocks, but the cost of living pressures at the moment are considerable. The one thing I'd love to see, though, a few years ago, somebody described Victoria as the Massachusetts of Australia. Because of the big vision Victorians had for their state and how Victoria could lead the way in the national agenda. And there is a pride, I think, amongst Victorians at our ability to do that. But at my old job, the Centre for Policy Development, we did some attitudes research on what Australians want from their democracy. And the answer chosen 3 times as much as any other answer was Australians wanted their democracy to boost equality, especially for the most vulnerable. And unlike other countries where you ask the same questions and people have quite procedural answers about what democracy is, the right to vote, the right to participate, Australians and especially Victorians want their democracy to be as much about ends as it is means. And so as much as is possible, it would be terrific if the election debates are about what a big vision for the state is and should be, particularly when it has been toughest in Victoria through the pandemic with the rolling lockdowns and the impact that has had, especially on children. And so having a bigger discussion about the sort of future we want here and how people can live more flourishing lives is, I think, something that people respond to very positively, regardless of the media source that they're getting that information from.
Well, let's turn to that question about what our big picture and the kind of society we want to be and how we make it. We're hearing, in a sense, some choices, I think, in this part of the electoral campaign, choices perhaps between road infrastructure and hospitals. Probably everyone's got a bit of an interest in roads. If you're in a busy road and it's not moving fast enough, you think, why shouldn't this be better? You need hospitals. They're all pretty obvious kind of things, but there must be other big questions that carry us about the kind of society into the future, let's just go around and see, just name one extra big issue that should be in the mix, as well as a debate about roads versus hospitals. Danielle, do you want to kick off first?
Yes, so I'll say education, which is another big area, of course, of state responsibility and state spending. I think we should very much be hearing a vision for a system of better education. I'm extremely concerned looking at the data, the fact that Australian students are falling behind, not just sort of comparable countries in reading and maths, but also, our own performance 20 years ago. We're actually going backwards on, those sort of core subjects and results, and we have a huge equity gap in schools. So the fact that by the time you get to year 9, the average student whose parents didn't complete high school, 4 years behind in reading and maths compared to students whose parents have a tertiary degree. And that gap just gets wider throughout schooling rather than narrower, as you would hope. So I think there is a big story on education. It's not always about money. Grattan's been doing a lot on how do we actually work with the resources we've got to deliver better results. We put something out earlier this week on the fact that in a lot of subjects we don't have core curriculum materials. So every teacher is reinventing the wheel. Every time they take a new class, they're up at midnight on Wikipedia trying to come up with curriculum materials. This is madness. They should have a common base of really high quality materials that they then work off and focus on how they then teach and target students. So there are things like that. We need to be increasing the prestige of teaching, and one thing that's really important there is actually providing the opportunity for career progression for those who really flourish in the profession. At the moment, basically your starting pay, you might increase $10,000 and then you've reached your cap. We know that if we want to attract the best and brightest, we need to give them a sense of progression. So, more levels that they can progress to, and getting the best teachers to actually develop others in the profession and build that sense of real professional development is critical as well. I've got more as well in that space. Early childhood education, I know Travis can talk to, is really critical as well. But I just think a vision around let's build a really strong education system that is hopefully narrowing rather than increasing those equity gaps that Travis was talking about, I think would be really compelling. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean a whole lot more money.
Yeah, I was just reflecting as you were speaking, Danielle, that there seems to be an integration effort that is relevant here, because speaking to a number of people involved in tertiary education, often there's announcements about inserting mental health practitioners in a place, or early childhood teachers, or there's a whole bunch of things which in a way at the level of announcement you think that's good, this would be a good resource. But then there is a long pipeline to actually get those people there, and sometimes if it's say like qualified psychologists, it's much more than an electoral cycle, and so you end up with this question, I suppose, about the integration of a lot of the parts of the society working together, because there's some things you just can't press the button and make it happen in the kind of way that I guess our contemporary politics likes to give an impression that I've done this is going to happen, it's a deliverable, it's signed off, forget about it. And things have a much greater integration. And I guess we learnt that through the whole supply chain things in other areas during COVID. And some people are saying that there is an unprecedented opportunity for Victoria in there being political alignment between the Andrews government and the federal government now, in terms of where the Commonwealth and state resources might coincide for some of these big pictures. And I just want to perhaps pause on that for a moment and just ask, let's go around and just talk about what's the kind of the moment that might be there. Sean, do you think there is a moment with what we've heard about some of the expenditure in the federal budget that's been the infrastructure expenditure, very significantly Victoria and so on? Is there an alignment here which is going to be an advantage for the re-election of the Andrews government?
Yes, I think. Well, I think we're seeing that. We're seeing it today. I think in the news, there's an announcement on energy between a sort of a join up between the Albanese government and the Victorian government, and there are many opportunities for that. And just going to Danielle's point about education, I couldn't agree more. I think especially having a more robust and effective state education system that ensures opportunity and quality would be such an enormous benefit for so many people who live in certainly middle and outer suburban Melbourne and in the regional cities as well. But I think to your point about sort of the opportunity of synergies offered by the synergy of having Labor governments, well, the only problem here, I think, is something else, which actually is something that I think Travis and Danielle would know more about than me. But you know, are we paying our way? Are we? You know, there's a whole issue about, given all the things that we want from modern life and from governments, are we actually generating enough taxation revenue to actually pay for it? And that's a much larger conversation that governments have shied away from for 20 years or more. And that's something that we're not going to be discussing, I suspect, in the next sort of 5-6 weeks in Victoria. But I think that is probably the fundamental opportunity if the federal government wants to bring that on and deal with mostly state Labor governments.
Travis, what's your view on that?
Well, and I'm sure we'll come to that point from Sean in a moment. On the synergies between the new federal government and the state government, I think the early years is one. I think employment is another. Jobs Victoria has had a particular approach to helping job seekers that are marginalised in the labour market. And I think climate is a third. I think they're real opportunities for alignment. On the choices or the opportunities, I mean, Danielle kind of flagged it, but yeah, I would put children and the early years right front and centre because of the moment nationally that exists, but also, you know, the facts which should alarm anyone really. Like it's Anti-Poverty Week this week. There's a special focus on child poverty. The latest statistics, I think it's 1 in 6 Australian children grow up experiencing poverty and disadvantage. That's 750,000 children. We're sliding backwards on the amount of number of children that start school developmentally vulnerable. It's 1 in 5, and that jumps to 2 in 5 if you don't have access to early learning. And it's particularly tough for single parents and their children. When we've heard stories across our services of people in our Saver Plus program who are doing that program to save money so they can afford to send their kids on school excursions. Single mothers in our multicultural playgroups are asking to take home the cut fruit that's left over so they can have it for their other children. Yesterday, the New South Wales government legislated a $5 billion commitment for the early years and for female workforce participation. And I think what's interesting about that is New South Wales and Victoria have jointly committed to 2 years of universal preschool. This isn't a sort of a partisan agenda around the early years. And what I would like to see is that the early years are a priority regardless of who wins government, because it's where we can make the biggest difference to the ability of all Australians to live flourishing lives and make the biggest difference in the amount of people in the country that are experiencing poverty and disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that looking at public policy through the lens of the most vulnerable people in society and the impact our policy decisions makes, you know, is one which is a pretty rigorous approach. Danielle, you touched on that a bit earlier before, but what if we go beyond education, we look at other questions which are linked to it, like security of housing, public housing policies, all the sort of things that we kind of have a bit of a feel into, but they just seem to keep accelerating beyond us. Is there a big position that we should take there, like we seem to want to take on roads or hospitals. Danielle, you got a view on that?
Look, so this is challenging, and Travis will know the stats much better than me, but I think if we look at poverty and the kind of policy levers that we have available, we kind of know what works. A lot of them sit with the federal government, but frankly, the rate of job seeker is a huge issue. The design of single parenting payment and the fact that single mothers are pushed off that when their youngest child turns 8 and then onto the job seeker payment. The fact that rent assistance, which is designed to help those that don't have access to social housing, very low income people trying to rent in the private market, that we know is extraordinarily difficult at the moment, and that payment has nowhere near kept pace with the rise in rents. We could, massively reduce poverty overnight if we did something on those fronts. We did it during COVID, so we kind of know what matters. I think they are largely in the hands of the federal government. State governments can play a role in putting pressure on the federal government to act. It is amazing to me that this is not more politically salient than it is. The fact that the stats on child poverty, I think, are absolutely heartbreaking. Yet it's not a top order political issue. And I think, all governments can play a role in putting that front and centre in the agenda. Obviously, state governments do have a role in providing social housing. The Andrews government has made a major commitment and is kind of underway. That is underway, but that is time limited. And Travis can talk more about that. But that's really the kind of most direct lever that the Victorian government will have to make a difference to these problems.
Yes, Travis?
So just on those 2 points, so if you were to invest in the early years, there are 2, and you touched on this before, Archbishop, there are 2 systems that state governments do have, a huge responsibility in, that will determine the rate with which you can make a serious dent in the early years and the early years infrastructure. So one is around employment and one is around housing. So I think it's less than 3% of our housing stock in Victoria is social housing, and much of that is overcrowded, and we know the stress for renters in particular. And the latest numbers that I saw suggested Victoria needs around 6,000 new social dwellings a year for the next decade to address this. And unfortunately, the social housing commitment via the big housing build at the moment runs out in 2024. So regardless of who wins the election, a commitment to social housing will need to be determined by that return government or new government. It's worth remembering we did solve for these issues through COVID, right? We lifted people out of poverty overnight. We took off sleepers and housed them. But even in 2020 and 2021, over 40,000 young people presented a loan to homeless services. Right? So this is something that should concern all of us. It could happen to any of us. The other thing is employment. So despite the best intentions of governments to make early learning and kinder universal, one of the reasons why it's starting at 5 hours for 3-year-olds in Victoria is because we need more early childhood educators. I think the projections were we needed something like 40,000 nationally by 2023. So what state governments can play an outsized role in is employment strategies to build that early years workforce and their funding commitments around social housing, because without those 2 levers, investments in the early years won't have the housing or the employment to sustain them.
Yeah, Sean, any views on that kind of I suppose the big balance between different things and who they impact on?
Yes, so there's something going on, I think, in terms of the sort of political impact of this. It strikes me, I mean, if I was to offer, beyond education, I would have thought state government really needs to have a good look at the type of metropolis that it's actually overseen. you know, we need to look at the sort of communities that we're creating essentially in suburban Melbourne, and how much opportunity there is for work. We saw the strain during the pandemic of people who were working in the sort of distribution areas and other areas, allied health, all sorts of other areas, and they were living in places that were a long way from work, and they needed to travel, and there were all sorts of issues. And that's where there's a lot of unhappiness about the Labor government, so it would seem. People don't feel that they've been progressively that they've been delivered the types of vibrant communities with services and transport links that they deserve and that they see that exist in other more affluent parts of Melbourne. I think to me that's a very, very large issue, and it goes to the types of access that families and children especially have when there's not a lot of money around, and that's where that's really what Labor governments certainly are there to try to address as they progress. So I suspect there might be some very interesting results on election night and beyond in a lot of those areas of Melbourne. I mean, that's been canvassed in the media at different times in recent months. But I think that's an issue that still is going to need to be tackled, whoever is in office, obviously. And it's a massive issue, I think, as Melbourne continues to grow.
I'd just like to turn to the budget constraints. We hear a lot about deficits, but we seem to have an appetite for more government services and more spending that seems to contradict what we might otherwise hear about sustainability of deficit budgets. Let's just explore that a bit, because I think we've touched on the need for more revenue sources for governments at every level, but how do we as a society sustain what we seem to have as an unquenchable appetite for better resources and services generally? Question of how fairly they're distributed, I know, but how do we balance that against what we see, world trends, possibility of a recession in some countries into next year, and known fiscal restraint into the future? How do we hold that together? Turn to you, Danielle.
Oh, thanks.
You're an economist, you know these things.
So look, this is, I think it was Travis that said before, this is really an acute challenge right now. And I think they're both before the federal election and now before this state election, I don't think we've fully grappled with what this looks like. So Victoria, unsurprisingly, has come out of COVID with significant levels of public debt, which are forecast to continue to grow. So in 4 years' time, about $167 billion of net debt. At the moment, the way we're talking about dealing with that is gradually bringing the budget back into surplus. It's forecast to get there in 4 years' time, and then starting to pay down debt. I'm very sceptical about whether that surplus and that sort of trajectory will be achieved, given the broader economic environment that you just referred to, Archbishop. There are the sort of dark storm clouds on the horizon that our federal treasurer is talking about are very real. I think we've had a government that's become accustomed to upside surprises through things like stamp duty and land tax, because we've had a very buoyant housing market. We are now seeing that process in reverse, and that has very significant implications for state budget positions. So, ultimately, when you've got that kind of challenge, you either have to cut services or increase revenues. That's the, or push the cost, out into the future and onto future generations. So I think probably at both federal and state government level, there will have to be some consideration of the tax base. Those are really hard conversations, but the only way I think you have that is you link it to the services. So as you say, if people want more and better services, I think particularly in health, where there are acute challenges and more money will be needed, you have to find a way to tell the story of why you're doing that. You also do need to control spending though, and I think that's important too. You have to look for areas where spending has not been high value and try and control those. But I think ultimately, when you're in that world of budget repair, which we're going to be in coming years, you've got to show that you're kind of doing the hard yards on both sides of the budget, but it does mean really, really difficult trade-offs. And, not everything that everyone wants funded will be funded, and some people will have to pay more taxes.
Travis, what's your economic and balance into the future look like?
Well, I mean, I'm not the star economist on this panel. It's Danielle, and she did have a very memorable quote from the Job Summit, where she was the opening keynote speaker, and she talked about how if untapped women's workforce participation was a massive ore deposit, we'd have governments lining up to give tax concessions to get it out of the ground. But I agree with Danielle that we need a mature conversation about the balance of tax and tax expenditures on income, land, wealth, resources, the environment, and consumption, because the revenue base isn't high enough, particularly at the state level, and it's probably not reliable enough as well to sustain the services that the community expect. I don't think it's necessarily always about more revenue, and the Federal Treasurer has been speaking about this. It's also about quality spend. We've been quite critical here at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence of the National Employment Services System, Workforce Australia, which is a $7 billion system, and we don't think it works well for job seekers that are marginalised in the labour market. We think it could be much better spent with much greater outcomes. Next week, there will be a wellbeing statement that accompanies the federal budget, and I think that will prompt a conversation about the level of revenue and expenditure that's necessary to sustain services that allow Australians to live lives that they value. And I think it's a very important conversation that the country needs to have, and will impact federal-state financial relations. Just one other observation on this one, Archbishop. I spent 6 years in the UK and came back in 2013. And the one thing that shocked me, having missed the Rudd-Gillard years, was how difficult it was to have a difficult conversation publicly in Australia on things that are sort of tricky issues politically, like climate, where it seemed like you had to use synonyms if you wanted to talk about climate change. You had to use climate variability and other words to have conversations with government officials. And the same is true on tax. We seem to make debates about tax, about one particular tax reform, whether it's the stage 3 tax cuts, whether it's the GST, instead of having a broad conversation about the balance of tax and tax expenditures that can sustain budgets and sustain the services that we rely on.
Yeah, Sean, what's the balance look like for you?
Well, I'm with Travers, although I suspect I'm in an even more pessimistic part of the campsite when it comes to having difficult debates in modern day Australia. My exposure to politics goes back to 1979. I'd like to be able to say it was, I went to Canberra as a small child, but in fact I was a fully fledged adult, and went up there to cover politics for the old Melbourne Herald, now part of the Herald Sun. And one thing I can say over those years is that politics has increasingly become far more performative at both federal and state level, which means that everybody talks about governments being reformed for this, but I think governments and the public largely have gone hand in hand into that place where we just don't want to have those difficult conversations that might cost us something. Everybody was on board with climate change, doing something about climate change in 2007, but by the time it got to 2010, a lot of the support had fallen away because people started to understand it might cost them something. And then we had a government that wasn't robust enough to actually stick to its guns. That was an enormous lost opportunity, but it also gave a signal to everyone in politics, I think, at all levels, that there's a lot to gain for the other side to basically just cut up rough and exploit the confusion and the inability for large groups of Australians to coalesce around ideas, and especially ideas for change. So we've got this atomisation that's been going on, and I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And, you know, unfortunately, at the federal level, we've got a government that has like the barest majority, one of the smallest sort of primary votes ever for a government. And it's just going to get harder and harder, sadly. So I wish I could come up with some sort of happy way to end this part of my contribution, but it's deeply, deeply concerning. And you know that in a way, I think what Danielle was saying before about the Victorian government is they've just pushed things off, you know. And in a way, we also see on the health question that the opposition is doing a bit of that as well by saying, well, we're just going to build lots of infrastructure, which will take years and years. So, you know, there are tough things that need to be said at the political level, and they're not being said right now.
Yeah, well, I think that you've come back to where, in a sense, we started talking about the increasingly performative nature of politics. And I think, you know, spanning a bit of a similar time, looking at various versions of Australian politics, it's less and less now that people could probably name the members of the cabinet. Whereas I think if you take things back a generation or more, cabinet ministers were much more prominent in owning the responsibility for their particular portfolios. Now, I think both the states and nationally, it's all about the strong leader who, if there's any announcement, it'll be the strong leader, the Premier or the Prime Minister, who makes it. So I agree with your analysis that we are more performative in how we look at things. And but I think on the citizen side of the equation, I suspect we've tolerated this and allowed this to happen. So you know, it's kind of easy in these discussions to think we've all been caught up in you know, a tricky plan of others, but I think as citizens we've somehow got that. And I wonder, is there any space for a political discourse, whether at the state level, but let's look at it at the state level particularly, that just looks at those things about what's being a decent society, you know, about a vision of society, which is why I've had these breakfast conversations now for about 15 years, to look at what sort of society you want to be. Because I think that there's a great power in ordinary people as citizens being articulate and having a vision. Because end of the day, you know, when you've got the decline of participation in political parties, you have, you know, federal intervention across state parties, it all can get pretty much political rather than really hearing the real issues. So I suppose I'm just turning to this thing about, you know, your sense of optimism. Do you feel optimistic about the kind of capacity we have in Victoria to have a vision, to be participating and contributing to it, and for that to be something that we then, because we have a vision, we're holding governments accountable for delivering that vision, rather than selling us their vision and we're sort of, you know, the retail customers. It's a bit of a rambling question, I know, but it's about an empowered citizenry contrasted with just this kind of empowered and you know, clever functioning political system. Travis?
Oh, look, I'm optimistic. Like, I know that, you know, parts of this discussion have been a bit grim and bleak, but I think through a lot of the pandemic, and it's still impacting us, of course, COVID-19, it's far from over. I think we saw the best of a lot of people, and particularly a lot of communities, wrapping their arms around each other and doing what they could to support their neighbours, and we're seeing that across the services now, whether people are working in the services or volunteering in them. I mean, I think there is an appetite amongst leaders at all levels of government to hear directly from people experiencing services and how they're faring. And one of the the most powerful parts of the recent National Jobs Summit was the panel that they held on with participants who were part of the employment services system and could speak about their own experiences in it. And two participants within BSL services were part of that panel, Nathan and Shama. Shama, a refugee from Afghanistan, a young woman, and Nathan from Frankston, who had lost a parent to domestic violence, his mother to domestic violence. And you could hear a pin drop in that session. And they spoke very powerfully about what had made a difference in their lives and how that experience should inform the reforms that that were being considered. I think there is more delegation happening nationally at the moment. I mean, Danielle's just been appointed to a task force, on female participation, economic participation. And I think there is a genuine will amongst leaders of all political persuasions in Victoria to hear directly from communities about what is making a difference in their lives. The big question, I think, for us is the conversation that started through COVID. What are we bouncing to? What's COVID a bridge to? What sort of society do we want to sustain as we recover from the pandemic, as opposed to going back to a world that people were already struggling in and doing it tough in? So how do we sustain the investment in care and education and social infrastructure that means that we're better prepared for the next systemic shock, and that we are responding to the will of Victorians to let their democracy improve the lives of others and make us more equal in a fairer society?
I think you mentioned the Jobs Summit, perhaps more than just that comment, and there's a whole opportunity of engagement through those kinds of things. I suppose politically risky for some people who advise in government, but there seems to be a lot that's quite empowering about that kind of engaging policy and the people who are affected by it. Is that something we've seen to any extent during the last couple of terms of the government here in Victoria? What do you think is the appetite for that kind of hearing and listening to what the ordinary people say? I'm sure we've got the focus groups working, but this is a different concept. Danielle, what's your sense of appetite amongst politicians at state level to really hear from ordinary people?
That's a great question. Look, I know this is very big in the bureaucracy, and this is the kind of level of government that we actually don't, you don't see much from the outside. But this sense of place-based policy, working with the communities, co-designing policy, so it's relevant for the communities in which it's impacting, is very real and a real point of passion in the bureaucracy. So I think that's been a really positive development. I would say, and Sean might have a better view of this than me, I've seen less of that sort of active engagement, perhaps at a political level. I've, throughout my career, really wanted to kind of break down the kind of voices that politicians, particularly ministers, hear from. We know that, the kind of well-organised and well-resourced are there knocking on the door, and that's the power of lobby groups, and what it means is there's a whole lot of voices that get lost. So I think it is up to the political leaders to actively seek out those voices. I totally agree that lived experience panel at the Job Summit was incredibly powerful. So I would like to see, through parliamentary processes and things like that, more ways to bring in those sort of voices, because I think decision makers need to hear directly from the people impacted as well. So if there was more discussion about how we could do that going forward, I think that would be a real positive. But I would say on the bright side that I think it's definitely happening at the level of the bureaucracy at the moment, and there's real understanding of the importance that we need to actually use the voices of citizens who are directly impacted by services.
And Sean, do you have a take on this, the appetite to really engage with this at a political level?
Yeah, I think it's mixed. I definitely think it is true that the government has been trying to find ways to better understand the needs of communities in terms of coming up with policies. That's true. A lot of that is partly because there are so few community links now with political parties. So what you find is governments, because there aren't sort of agreed trusted sources of news as in the way that there were, political party organisations are really just a directorate and a kind of residual number of party members who are more extreme versions of non-members out there who vote for that particular political party, and they're small in number and they don't really operate as much, certainly on the Labor Party side. I mean, the Labor Party itself doesn't even function at the state level and hasn't, because it's been under sort of federal control for 2.5 years now, and still going to remain that way for quite a while. So you're just not getting information sort of just naturally flowing between ministers, politicians, senior bureaucrats, and ordinary folks. So they try and compensate by doing focus group research and doing lots of it and having lots of advertising and then testing whether that's working. That's a problem. What I'm hoping is that we will have. I'm just going to Trevor's point. Maybe there's a reset going on. We'll see. And part of this election maybe is part of that reset after the pandemic, after the lockdowns, that we will now be able to sort of come together more. We've understood the power of community. That can be our hope, and that politicians will respond in kind, whoever wins or has power or shares power after the election.
Some questions have been given us before we've come online. I sort of might just seek your views quickly on some of these. Just pertinent to the last comment, has the public service been increasingly politicised and undermined, and how do we persuade the next government to seek impartial advice? Has the independence of the public service suffered, and what do we do about it? Danielle?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think it has suffered. So I think the public service is an incredibly important institution, and that its independence should be protected at all costs. I think there has been a tendency, and this has been common, but I think it has been particularly pronounced in Victoria to centralise power in the sort of office of the Premier, but also then to put people who are seen as loyal and trusted at the kind of echelons right across the public service. That concerns me, and I would like to see a return to the sense of an independent public service that, yes, is there to serve the government of the day, but equally has a role in serving the public interest over time. So I would like to see governments a whole lot less active in the appointments, particularly once you get down below the secretary level, because having the kind of career public service with deep expertise without an affiliation to either side is incredibly important for stability and good policy making in the longer term.
Another question I'm going to throw out there is why is health such an issue in Victoria? After 8 years of Labor government, is this a big negative for them? Anyone like to take that on? Sean.
So I would say it's an issue here. Sorry, I'll quickly go, Sean, and then leave it to you. But I mean, Victoria is facing challenges, but health systems around the world are. So obviously COVID has had a big impact. It has created all sorts of workforce challenges and burnout issues, and it will be incredibly important for whoever forms government to address those, but they're certainly not unique to Victoria.
That's absolutely. I couldn't agree more with Danielle. I think I suppose I'd just say make this kind of slightly more typically superficial political point. Given that I'm from the media, that the issue in terms of the Victorian election is that yes, Labor, that while there are a lot of commonalities with the sort of issues of our health system being under strain, the fact is that in the previous Labor government, Daniel Andrews was health minister. he's been associated with health in many ways, and it is the case that Labor, over the past 23 years, Labor's held office for all but 4 years. So whatever, it's more likely to stick, I think, the problems with our system, just because that's the way it looks, as well as what are clearly performance issues, like with the ambulance system, I'd say. So yeah, it's a great point of vulnerability, I think, in terms of the electoral context.
Yeah, Travis?
Well, I think those two questions are somewhat related, because the strain on the health system goes partly to how it's structured within a public service instead of sort of community services, and how it draws on community health networks and related services that mean there's greater or less strain on health systems and hospitals. So I think it's a particular issue in Victoria because of the strain of the last couple of years, and because of decisions that have been made around how it's structured within the public service and across communities. Just on the politicisation of the public service, I mean, I agree with Danielle that it's one of the best investments you can make into the capability and memory and experience of a public service. I think one thing we've seen across the country and across the world in COVID, as you see in crises, is that the executive becomes more dominant than a legislature or a judiciary, and that's what happens in times of crisis. I think what's really important now is that there's a recalibration, and part of that recalibration is investing in the independence and experience of whether it's the Australian public service or the Victorian public service, because that should sustain any government regardless of their colour. And I just thought, Archbishop, with the conversation we had earlier about lived experience and voice, there will be a big focus over the next 18 months on the voice and a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, and a way of giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a permanent voice, which has been denied for too long. And of course, with referenda, you need a majority of the states and a majority of the people. And I would hope that regardless of the outcome, there's a strong Victorian commitment to amplifying the voice and accepting that offer in the Uluru Statement.
This may well be the last question we cover off on. There seems to be significant secrecy about the effects of COVID and lockdowns, with various reports not being released. What should we know that we don't know?
It's a big question. Look, I think the Ombudsman made some really important recommendations about the decisions around the hard lockdowns, particularly of the public housing estates. I think it's inevitable that there will be a National Royal Commission into COVID, as there should be, with such a huge shock nationally, and a proper interrogation of the decisions that governments took throughout the pandemic, so it can inform responses to future pandemics.
Yeah, Danielle?
Look, I don't have much to add. I fully, I'm often skeptical of royal commissions in the policy world, but I think this is one that absolutely makes sense. I think, we should put actions of both state and federal governments under scrutiny so we can do better next time. And so I would be very much supportive of that, as long as we, of course, remember the challenging environment in which decisions were being made. We can all be wise in hindsight, but I think even taking that into account, there are things that we could have done differently and better, and we should learn from them.
And Sean?
Well, the Victorian opposition is pledging to hold an inquiry at that level into our sort of pandemic response. But I don't think you'd really say that it looks to be in the sort of nature of the Andrews government to be able to be doing something like that. I mean, I think the time for holding on to all of the information is gone. And you'd have to hope that on the other side of the election, the government finds it in itself to do a proper examination at a public level. Very difficult to draw up the sort of terms of reference for that without restarting a lot of the hysteria. But we definitely need to have a good look, because you know, we wouldn't really want to be going through something like that all over again, where there must be better ways. There have to be better ways to respond to it.
And Sean, you were, I think, undertaking to give us your prediction of the election earlier. One you wanted to offer to those listening?
Can I just qualify that, Archbishop? Journalists are trained to write about what's happened before they start writing, and it's not in our skill set to. So I actually believe that it's going to be so much will matter between what happens now and election day. Things can change. I just have in my mind the 1999 experience of Steve Bracks just getting over the line with the support of a small group of crossbenchers, when he had to get a similar number of seats. I think it was 16 or something the Labor Party needed to get. I'm sorry, I should have those numbers in my head. It's a little more daunting for the coalition. Steve Bracks was a new person on the scene. Matthew Guy is the recycled guy who led them last time, so it's not the same. Nothing's ever the same. I think there's a chance that we will get to a point where Labor's lost enough seats that they might be having to deal with some crossbenchers, possibly, to be able to govern effectively.
Yes, I've heard that from other commentators. Well, look, just in wrapping up, thank you very much. If again we were gathered, there'd be a thunderous round of applause for Sean, Travers, and Danielle for your insights. But great for those who've joined online, and I hope that this has informed you a little more about the choices that we'll all exercise on the 26th of November. It might even inspire you to be a bit more informed to write to your local candidates and ask them their views on things. I mean, I think there is a great power in that grassroots exercising of your citizen rights for those seeking election, because if they're ever going to be responsive to your concerns, this is your window to do it. So I've got a friend in New South Wales who still writes beautifully handwritten letters, several a week, to various people about refugee causes and other things that he's very passionate about. And he finds that just by doing that, it does get an impact, and he gets some attention. So please exercise all of your rights. Thank you for joining online. I'm going to conclude now with a prayer, which is from our Anglican prayer book about good government, which is what we pray for in the decisions that we make at any election. Spirit of justice and truth, grant to our governments and all who serve in public life wisdom and skill, imagination and energy. Protect them from corruption and the temptation of self-serving. Help us to commit ourselves to the common good, that our land may be a secure home for all its peoples. Through Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. Amen. Well, thank you for your participation today, and every blessing as we make this possibly volatile journey to the end of November. Thanks once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.